Hello, welcome to the Thinkers50 Radar 2023 series, brought to you in partnership with Deloitte. I'm Des Dearlove.
And I'm Stuart Craner, and we are the founders of Thinkers50. For more than 20 years, Thinkers50 has been identifying, ranking, and sharing extraordinary business and management ideas. At the start of every year, we announce 30 management and business thinkers to watch in the coming year. These are the new and exciting voices of management.
The result for 2023 is an eclectic group of people who we believe will make an impact with their ideas, their campaigning, their research, and their passion in the coming 12 months. More than that, by showcasing their ideas, we hope they will be inspired to carry the torch for management thinking in the years ahead.
They don't have all the answers, but they are asking important questions, as we will see today. And talking of questions, we welcome yours. Please let us know where you are joining from today and send over your thoughts, questions, insights at any time during the session.
Today, we are delighted to be joined by one of those exciting new voices, Pia Lauritzen. Pia is a Danish philosopher and academic. She has a PhD in philosophy from Aarhus University and is known for her work on the universal power of questions.
You might have seen her TEDx talk, What You Don't Know About Questions. Her 5 books include Questions Between Identity and Difference, and she's hard at work on a new book, which hopefully she'll be able to talk about.
Pia is the founder and CEO of Qvest, a technological company that has developed a platform for unleashing the power of questions in companies and communities. She's also a founding member of the non-profit association, The Question Collective. Pia, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So before we leap into your, how did you first become interested in the nature of questions and their power?
I think I've always been interested in the nature of questions, but I didn't realize how interested and how also professionally interested I was until maybe 20 years ago, or something like that. I think I was finalizing my thesis. I was taking my master's in philosophy at the university, and I was finalizing my thesis when I realized that this German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, he was kind of struggling with the idea that the question of what it means to be human, that he wanted to rephrase it somehow. He wanted to ask that questions differently. And that just made me so curious to find out, what is it about these questions? Why does it matter how we phrase the questions? And why is it important that we ask all these questions? And I started studying questions. I've been doing that, for 2 decades.
It's funny you just mentioned Heidegger. My son's doing a master's in philosophy, so that name has kind of echoes in my ears. I hear quite a lot about him. But it's an interesting pathway. I mean, philosophy into sort of business and management sort of thinking.
Yeah, and I don't think that I ever thought about the combination as something I wanted to do. I was just doing my philosophy, and then when I was done doing that, or done with my education, I was kind of figuring, what would I like to do? What is interesting? And then this guy came along and he was telling me about management consulting. And I thought, well, maybe that will be something I could do. I don't know. Being a philosopher, you can do all kinds of things or nothing. Kind of depends on your temper, right? And I just told myself I could do anything. So I just was a management consultant for a couple of years, and then one day at a Christmas party, I remember talking to this guy who was the founder of the business. And I was like, it's like my head is moving slower being a consultant than when I was being a philosopher. And he was just, whoa, that is not okay. Because he was too proud, that he was like, I don't like that. And then we just discussed that I needed to do a PhD. And then suddenly I was finding myself combining my philosophical interest with my experience as a management consultant. So it's kind of like practice and theory emerging somehow.
Mm.
You talk about democratizing the power of questions, Pia. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I realized when I did my PhD, I think that's 10 to 15 years ago, I realized that the problem with a lot of the management consulting experiences I had was that we had this idea that it is the management consultant or the leader or the internal consultant that has to ask all the good questions. So coaching sessions or doing interviews or even doing surveys when we want to find out what's going on in an organization. We have a few people asking questions, and all the rest of the people, they're being respondents. So they're only supposed to react to the questions that all the wise people, all the Socrates in today, all the questions they are asking. So it's kind of figuring out that maybe there's something going on here. Maybe we've been monopolizing the power of questions, not only in organizations, but in societies for thousands of years, maybe even since Socrates, because you see it, you know, in society at large. We have journalists, we have lawyers, we have teachers, we have a lot of professions that are supposed to ask questions, whereas everybody else is not. So I was figuring maybe if we democratize this extremely powerful resource that we all have, then we would get more insight, and we would also empower people to be curious together and collaborate and find out things that none of us can do alone. So that was kind of the idea. And then I started building tech to support that.
I mean, it's interesting to see Hal Gregerson has joined us. You mentioned Socrates. Hal isn't quite Socrates, but he's certainly working in the same field with his catalytic questions. It's great to have him here, and I'm sure he'll have some questions before the end of this session. I'm sure of that. Questions, we don't necessarily need the answers. I mean, questions are a beautiful thing in their own right. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think, you know, that some questions are just supposed to be answered, right? And that's the question. Maybe that's the questions we ask of a chatbot, or we ask, you know, at an exam, you know, to make sure do people know what they're supposed to know. And so of course there are questions whose main purpose is to be answered. But there are so many questions who have so many other purposes than being answered. They have social purposes, you know, connecting and exploring something together. They have what would you say, epistemological purpose. It's about not necessarily knowing what the truth is or knowing how something is, but getting a little bit closer, and again all the time getting a little bit closer. And when I'm working with executive teams in large organizations, I can see they are really struggling to accept that there are some questions they are not supposed to know the answer to. And it's totally okay. And it's also okay if their employees don't know the answer. And the effort to actually cultivate an environment in an organization, helping people to understand that it's okay to just, you know, be curious together. Because you kind of, you know, if we don't have more questions than answers, then we're not evolving, right? We need to have more questions. If we finally suddenly find ourselves having all the answers, then, well, that's it. Then there's no need for us anymore. So it's kind of like the basic instinct in human beings that we will always have more questions than answers. And that's why I think we might as well just join forces with the power of questions instead of trying to always get ahead.
So how did you set about doing research into questions?
So the first thing I did was actually to invent this flipped survey logic, saying, so instead of just collecting answers in a survey, I invited people to ask each other questions. So in organizations, and the first time I didn't have any technology supporting it. It was just, you know, me being the tech platform, sending questions and answers from people to each other. So I simply I flipped the logic and saying, now we have, let's say, 300 people and within an organization, and now they are invited to ask each other questions. So everyone gets to ask one question and choosing one recipient. Saying, I want to ask Stuart this question. It should be about a common topic, something we share. And then you respond, and then you get to ask a new question. So that way I can very easily collect a lot of data, a lot of question data, but also answer data. Because I think, you know, they come in pairs, right? You have question and answer. Sometimes you have more questions. Sometimes you have more answers. And then you have to figure out something is going wrong here. We need to be more curious. But that was my first step in exploring the nature of questions very from a practical level. Then I also did, that was my postdoctoral studies. I did observational studies of school classes, simply finding out how do teachers use questions in different language communities. So I studied a Russian, a Chinese, a Spanish, and a Danish school class to find out, do they use questions differently? And how does that impact the teaching environment? How does that impact the learning and the interaction between the students and the teacher, but also among the students? How do they interact differently depending on how the teacher uses questions? And that was just extremely interesting to see how different we use questions in different language communities.
Because there's huge cultural differences, aren't there?
Huge, yeah.
Can you give us a flavor of that, and just an idea of how they're different?
Yeah, so I actually found that there is a very close connection between asking question and distributing responsibility. So you can also hear it in the wording. So you pose a question, you take a position, and then someone is supposed to give a response and take responsibility. So and that is a connection you can actually find in all Indo-European languages. This is not only true in Danish and English and German. You can find it in Spanish and French, Italian. So that connection was really, really interesting for me to find out. So how does the teacher use her questions to find out whether she's responsible or whether the kids are responsible or whether something else is responsible for the learning experience? And these were the basic differences I found, that you have these 3 different ways of distributing responsibility when using questions. Either you use question, and that is actually what I found in the Chinese school class. I found that the teacher was using questions to take responsibility herself. So she was asking a question, but it was like a test question or a quiz question to find out whether the students knew the same thing she was knowing. Whereas in the Danish and the English language culture, it's the exact opposite. When we ask a question, we pose responsibility on someone else. So I ask a question, and now it's your turn, Stuart. Now you should come up with the answer. Now it's not my responsibility anymore. So it's the exact opposite. And that it goes without saying that working in a global organization, for instance, where you have all these different language cultures, if you have this basic differences in how you use questions to distribute responsibility, then you will have a lot of misunderstandings all the time, expecting people to do something and they are not because they are expecting something else, basically. So these are some of the differences I found.
Fascinating. And you've collected and analysed over 30,000 questions across organisations. I mean, what a fascinating project. What's your research findings? What did you discover from that? What's going on?
Oh, so many things. I really think I have enough data now for a lifetime. I don't think I will stop collecting data, but there is so much to learn from this. And I've only, I take different entrances into the data. And what we did last year was we took a data set of, I think it's about 10,000 questions and 6,000 answers from the Qvest platform. And then we were looking at how does these questions impact the behavior of the recipients. So instead of just saying, okay, this is a great question, or this is a good question, I actually talked with Hal about some of these findings as well. He was kind enough to look at the data with me. So discussing and finding out what are the impact indicators. And what we could see is that basically you can just say, well, if you receive an answer on the Qvest platform, either you do nothing, and then the question, at least not, it doesn't have a measurable impact. But you could also, you receive a question and you respond, and that's it. So that would be, then it would have an impact somehow. It resulted in an answer. But as I mentioned before, in a Qvest, you always get the opportunity of asking a new question when you have responded to a question. So that's another impact indicator, that your question is sparking something in the recipient, inspiring the person to continue the conversation. So that would be another impact indicator. And finally, what we found is that some of the questions, they had a response, and we all know this, that sometimes when people ask you a question, you say, oh, that's a good question. or great question, or interesting question. So you immediately comment on the question. And we found about 4% of all the questions had that kind of response. So naturally, we started looking for, can we say something about these questions that trigger this great question response? And we found, and I think that's actually really interesting, we found the biggest difference between these kind of questions and all the other questions was the use of personal pronouns. So it was the fact that they used we instead of you when asking a question. We could see a huge difference in the data on that. And it makes a lot of sense based on what I just talked about with the different language cultures, that when we use we're kind of like opening up this space where we can be curious together. So it's not like I pose, responsibility on you, or take responsibility myself. I'm kind of saying, well, we should learn something together here. And by using we, that happens automatically, apparently. Or at least it increases chances of people being, oh, I want to share something with you.
So how can we, Pia, learn to be better with questions in other ways? Are there other ways of framing that we should use? Even as I'm repeating it back to you, I can feel it's a more open, if you know what I mean. It feels like there's a space between us that we can both contribute to. It's interesting, fascinating.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do also with Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety. It's about, do I feel, if I say we, I'm kind of like inviting everybody else to know that I'm insecure as well. I'm not sure yet. And I want you to be part of this, not necessarily insecurity, but I'm okay with being uncertain right now. And I invite you to do it as well. And I certainly think that has something to do with whether people feel now I can share what's on my mind as well, what I'm curious about, or what I'm a little bit in doubt about.
Robert Benin, who's watching, says, if we don't have more questions and answers, then we're not evolving. And that comment made his day. Yeah. And Hal Gregerson says, are we asking self-centered questions versus other-centered questions? And it's great distinction, an important distinction as well. Please send in your questions as the conversation evolves at any time. Tell us about your great question report. Came out in 2022, Pia, based on 15,000 questions. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Is it freely available, or how do people learn more about it?
It is. It's freely available at the Qvest.io. So it's just we just decided to share it, and then people can use it. It's, as I said, it's a lot of data. So I think we will have, that there is plenty for everybody who would be interested in doing research based on this data and finding out how to write about it. So I actually haven't published in any outlets about the report. We just shared it, and then we need to find out what will happen with this. And it's a resource for myself in the writing my next book, and it's a resource in the work I'm doing when writing my articles and doing my keynotes, of course. But it is available, and it is very much what I talked about before, about finding these impact indicators and finding out. For instance, we found out that when people use leader or leadership in that question, their chances of receiving an answer is not as high as if they use words like employees or workforce or customers. Or so there are these kind of findings that maybe sometimes leaders tend to be a little more interested in leadership than everybody else, and maybe it could be a good idea to pay attention to that when communicating in your organization, that if you want to talk about leadership, do it with your leader peers and not everybody else, because they really don't care. So that these kind of findings.
See, I was about to ask you a question about leadership, and now I'm not sure I can now that you've said that. Do you think that, I was having a conversation yesterday where I was talking to sort of, very high level leadership coaches. And I was saying, they asked me, what do I think has changed in leadership since the pandemic? And I said, I have a sense, I might be deluding myself, but I think we no longer expect our leaders or feel that our leaders necessarily have to know all the answers. we were deluding ourselves that they did know the answers, by the way, because they never did, but they pretended they did, and we allowed that pretense. But there's a sense now, but perhaps that it's okay to be a leader and say, I don't know, I don't know the answer to that. Let's try and figure it out together. Back to your creating space.
Yeah, I totally think so. As I know as Hal as well, and I've been working with this for decades, and I don't know if you experienced it the same way, but I totally, I can talk about things, I can write about things. My next article for Strategy and Business is about Heidegger. It's kind of like, okay, is that possible? It is. They really want me to write the article. So it's kind of like something has happened the past years, definitely. And I think everybody is saying, oh, okay, you don't need to know all the answers. That's okay. Everybody's saying it. Doesn't mean that they feel comfortable with actually practicing it. Not at all. I mean, I think I meet a lot of leaders who really, they are practicing to say it. They're practicing to feeling comfortable that, but I don't know, I don't need to know all the answers. And then when I come and say, no, you don't, and maybe you don't even need to know all the questions either. And then it's, stop. Now it's too much, right? But I think it is definitely something that people, it's just, the world is too complex. It doesn't make sense for anybody to think they can know all the answers. It just makes no sense.
There's a control thing there as well, I think. I mean, I think we're hopefully getting to realize that we don't control the universe. No one can control. We've seen enough things happen in the last, and perhaps people knew this centuries ago. I think maybe it was a 20th century delusion that we were going to, science was going to give us all the answers to all the questions. But now we're prepared to sort of let go because we just can't control everything.
I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
There seems to be a lot more interest in philosophy and its application to the business world. I know there's a book called Philosophy Inc. by Santiago Inúez from IE Business School, and there's a book called Philosophy at Work by the German Anders Inset. I wonder why that is. Why now? I mean, philosophy's obviously been around for thousands of years. So why the interest from the business and organizational world now?
Well, I think that we've tried everything else. It's kind of like, well, we have all the psychologists, we have all the behavioral scientists, we have all, the environmental people, biologists. We've tried everything else, and kind of like, well, none of them have all the answers, although they write and talk, at least some of them write and talk in a way as if they did. And it's kind of like, they are also now saying, some of them have been for a long time, but even the experts are saying we don't have all the answers. And then it's kind of like, well, what do you have? Well, we have questions. And then, but who has? I wouldn't say that it's not like philosophers have a patent on questions, but we are the only ones who, from the beginning, said we don't claim to know anything about anything. We just want to ask a lot of questions. and we know how to do that. We know how to be curious, and we know how to continue to be curious. And I think maybe that is, where else would we go by now?
Yeah. You make it sound as if involving the philosophers is some sort of desperate last throw of the dice.
I really think it feels like that for many people. It's kind of like, I really didn't want to do this, but now I feel I need to. No, I think I meet a lot of wonderful people who are really curious. And the beautiful thing about philosophy at the same time is that it's not that in one sense, it's very alien and strange and something people don't feel they can get a understanding of. But in another sense, it's the basic human nature. It's just, we were all kids once, we all have kids or no kids, and they are the greatest philosophers, right? They are asking questions all the time, and they're being curious and questioning basic assumptions and biases and all that kind of stuff. So they are practicing on a daily basis. And we realize that maybe we should learn from them rather than insisting on teaching them all the time how to understand the world. Maybe we should just be more curious. And I work a lot with Lego, for example, and that's just, they have children as their role models because that's how they see the world. And that's just, I really love that.
it does seem too, though, that I mean, philosophers, to some extent, philosophy is sort of inquiry about the human condition in a way that perhaps other disciplines don't think about it. And we do seem to be at this moment in time with the technology where we actually, the whole issue, I mean, obviously philosophers get involved in ethics and morality and some of these issues, which actually do seem to suddenly become extremely pressing. So it's kind of however it's come about, but perhaps it is the time to turn to the philosophers for some guidance on that. I certainly hope so. Rather, I don't know how my son's going to get a job. He's got a master's in philosophy. But you're inspiring that you've obviously made it work.
You can give me a call. We can figure something out.
But I wanted to have
seriously about the ethics of AI and stuff. I mean, presumably we are into different territory. It's not just about optimizing or efficiency, the old sort of business issues. There's something else going on now.
Yeah, but I think it's back to where we started actually, also with having a ChatGPT and all these chatbots and AI, where it's kind of like we realize that although we can ask the machine anything, and although it comes up with an answer, we're still unsatisfied. It's still like, and how come that is? Well, maybe that's because questions have another purpose, right? It's not only about receiving answers, it's also about, connecting with each other, learning from each other, being curious together, being okay with the fact that none of us have all the answers or even some answers. So it's about something else than getting answers. And I think that is just, I think it's very natural. Then you can make it more, actionable about talking about ethics and talking about regulations. And of course, philosophy plays a role in there, but it also plays a more Heideggerian role, which is just about what does it mean to be human? How do we reclaim our humanity? How do we stay human in a tech-obsessed world?
John Narvi says, philosophy helps us understand the abstract through questions, which is quite a neat summary. There's a question from Juan Carlos. How can we move from a telling mode to an inquiry mode during our customer meetings? Any tips or best practices you can share? Because I suppose changing behavior is the ultimate challenge of these things.
Well, it's a bit difficult because right now I'm not at all demonstrating what I would do in a customer meeting, because what I would do is typically not say that much. I would try to be as silent as possible, but it's kind of like I'm figuring that would not be a good deal for us right now. So I'm just blah blah blah. No, but that is actually what I try to do, to find out, get people to talk as much as possible before I start asking questions. Because if I start with my questions, then we all know that. Then the minute someone asks a question, we're all forced to focus on that. And we are all forced to focus on providing answers to that specific questions. But usually it makes more sense to find out what are the questions, whether formulated or not, that people are struggling with. And when they tell the story about the organization, or they tell what's going on in the team or whatever, then usually you can hear, okay, this might be a relevant question for me to ask right now. So I would always pause my questions until I have tried to figure out what are the questions they're asking themselves right now.
Interesting. Hal, let's got another question. What factors, contexts seem to help nudge leaders to ask more we versus I questions in a world of uncertainty? I guess, how can we, leaders who can be more inclusive, invite more, how do you nudge them towards perhaps inviting new voices into the conversation?
Now I want to say it's a great question. I'm not sure. My answer is always the same, and actually I think Hal is really brilliant at that, creating a space where people feel comfortable saying what's on their mind. And then little by little, they start being more curious about each other as well. If they feel comfortable that they can share what's going on with them, then they are starting to be curious about what's going on with others, because it's common ground somehow. Being uncertain or being curious or being a little bit in doubt, that's something we all have in common. That's what, you can talk with a child from that place. You can talk with a very experienced professor from that place. You can talk with a CEO or your teenage daughter. You can talk with everyone from that place. But you need to be willing to be there yourself first. And that's kind of, you cannot train, you cannot tell people, take this education and then you will be able to do it. It's something else. It's a way of being in the world, I think, that you can practice, of course, all the time. But
there's Anastasia from Greece, and it's curious. It's opposite that we've got somebody from Greece on the questions. She says, questioning is the path to new knowledge, which is quite a nice line in itself. In situations where we find ourselves in unfamiliar environments, how do we identify individuals receptive to our curiosity and wish for new learning? I suppose what Anastasia is saying is that we can ask really good questions, but if our audience and the people we're asking aren't receptive and aren't curious, it's going to fall on stony ground. Is there any way you can sense whether people are open to questions?
Well, we did say at the beginning you don't need to know all the answers, Pia. So we're certainly proving that.
That is really. I'm so grateful we started out that way. I think my own experience is, what I've been doing is the only social media where I'm actually active is here on LinkedIn, and I'm using it as I share questions and I share thoughts, and sometimes I share questions that my kids have been asking me, or questions from a client meeting, or I giving a keynote and someone maybe I will even share something from this conversation, to simply just share something that I'm curious about, and then what I realized is that I cannot at all foresee whether people will engage or not. Sometimes I share something, I think people will be curious about this, and then nothing happens. And other times I share something, it's just like, well, it was just a thought. And then people are being extremely curious and open to finding out more and asking me and even hiring me for all kinds of stuff. So I think my answer would be no, I really don't have a good way of finding out. I just need to stay open, because sometimes it comes from peculiar places where people are curious, but I didn't expect it to come.
I remember talking to Erin Meyer, who's the great expert of cultural difference and cultural relativity. She's American, lives in Paris, and she was saying she was on a trip to Japan, and she'd run an exec ed session, and she said, "Has anybody got any questions?" And there were no questions. And then she was going to carry on, but the person who was doing the work with us said, "Hold on a minute, wait," and said, "I think you want to ask a question." And because the Japanese culture being where it is, yes, there were questions, but they were waiting to be given permission in a certain way in order to step into the space to ask the professor questions. Of course, Erin tells the story to her own sort of detriment, because she's supposed to be the expert. But when she asked the guy, she said, "How did you know there was a question?" He said, "Because I could see her eyes were glistening."
Yeah.
And she looked and she'd seen that there was something, what someone wanted to ask a question, but it just needed to be allowed to.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Interesting, fascinating.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. I've heard the same thing about in global companies, leaders coming from Scandinavia, for instance, having employees in Japan or China saying, any questions? And everybody says no. And then they go home thinking everything is on track. Yeah. And then it's not, because people are not. That's back to the cultural differences we were talking about before. The second a Chinese employer or employee asks a question, she's assuming responsibility. She's saying, I will have the right answer. That's why I'm asking. And she's not in a position to do that. So she would never ask a question unless the leader is saying, and now I want you to ask me a question, because when you do that, they have questions. But it's just, to find out.
That's fascinating, that lens. That's something that's a really interesting way of looking at it in terms of who's responsible for the answer when you ask the question, who's taking power. I mean, it's powerful.
Exactly.
Really interesting.
Kelly Park says, Questions must be one of the best ways to keep the brain active as it seeks new interconnections to make meaning. So it's a recipe for a vibrant old age. Who knows? And somebody on LinkedIn says, what, if any, is the work on the relationship between the structure of a respective language and the types of questions that are plausible? And I suppose that goes back to what you were talking about, your research in different classrooms, that in different languages, questions come across in different ways and work in different ways. Yes.
So that is actually what I found out, because all the differences I described before, I couldn't see that. I want to start here. I don't speak Russian. I don't speak Spanish. I don't speak Chinese. I'm completely lost. So I was doing these observational studies, sitting in these classrooms, and what I could see is that people behaved very differently. Then I have interpreters translating, transcribing and translating all the questions asked during a lecture. And then they handed it over to me. And I looked at all the transcriptions, all the translations, and I was kind of like, I couldn't see the differences. I was like, this is useless. I can see there are differences when I observe these classes, but I cannot see it in the translations. So, I was really struggling, it was going on for weeks, and I was like, okay, let's do something different. Let's say, instead of you translating into Danish or English, as those were the languages I needed in order to communicate, instead of translating into Danish or into English, please translate from Chinese, from Russian, from Spanish, in the sense, stay true to the grammar of your language. I don't want you to translate into Danish or English grammar. I want you to stay true to your own grammar. And then what I received was gibberish, completely. It was really, because then all these things happen where people can leave things out. I think it's called linguistic ellipsis or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can leave parts of a sentence. You can leave that out in different languages. It's very difficult actually in Danish and in English, but in Russian, you do it all the time. In Chinese, you do it all the time. Leave out very important elements in a sentence that we would never be able to leave out. So I found out there was a very, very close connection between the grammar of a language and how they use questions. So that was, it was really technical because I'm not a linguistic professor at all. So I had to, I work with one to help me find out how to understand these differences, because it turned out to be that was the answer to the differences. It was how the grammar works and how it frames our way of thinking about and distributing responsibility.
That's fascinating, really interesting. You mentioned earlier that you're working on a new book.
Yes.
And you also mentioned about how we reclaim our humanity in a tech-obsessed world. I think that the new book and that thought are linked. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and what it's going to be and how far along it is?
It's not very far along. It's very early days. But I would love to talk about it because I am very excited about it. I think I finally in a place, with my research and with my experience, where I really feel that I can write a bit different book than I've been writing before, at least. It's actually, it's what I call a chat book. So not a chat bot, but a chat book. Because I want to demonstrate how a conversation can unfold between two humans. But it's not any humans, it's fictional characters. One is called Wisdom, and it's a woman. She knows a lot about the old philosophers, so she's inspired by a lot of male philosophers: Martin, Heidegger, Immanuel Kant,
wouldn't be in there somewhere.
Friedrich Nietzsche, Socrates, all the old guys. So she's very inspired by these guys. So she's using the knowledge from them. And then we have Future, who can represent any of us, basically, but it's based on all my question data. So it's a character that's very curious, asking a lot of questions. So it's kind of inspired by Plato's dialogues, where you have two people asking questions, but we don't have an expert knowing it all, like Socrates knew how to ask all the questions to get, all the ideas. No, we actually have a conversation where they're exploring topics that are relevant and important to anybody, such as technology. That's the first dialogue, education and leadership and stuff like that. Having conversations between these two characters. That's the idea.
So when can we expect to see that in our bookshops?
I have no idea.
That was the most difficult question of all, wasn't it?
It was the only one I could just answer immediately.
I suppose the question, there's a couple of comments from people. Monica Tabalesky says there's lots of autocratic leaders in corporations who still think they have all the answers and they know best. How can we change that? And Elizabeth says, in personality psychology, the most acknowledged personality test, the 5-factor model, actually has a measurable trait called openness to new experiences. So if companies hired people using that kind of personality scaling, maybe we can start hiring for more questioning people. But I suppose it gets down to, how do you, if we assume that questioning is a good thing, how can we recruit and reward people on the basis of being good at questioning and open to questioning? That wasn't really a question, was it? It was more that's the ultimate challenge.
More of a theory, the question.
Yeah. So to change the world, we need a different attitude to recruiting and rewarding, perhaps.
Yeah, but don't you think, I'm not sure, but don't you think that these things are changing by themselves within the next few years? I think everybody I talk to in companies are being blown away by their young colleagues and by, the next generation of workers, but also the next, our own kids. I think it's like these things are changing right now. And I think I'm not sure whether we need all these kind of measuring and performance. I think we need to go another way. And I think we will find out within the next decade or something. I think we will find another way to think about these things, because we will need everybody to think for themselves and be curious and be open with their uncertainties, and for them to do that. So one thing, we will need them to be that, and they cannot, if they are constantly being measured with a performance metrics that doesn't make sense. So that will need to change. And if we don't change first, they will replace us, I think. When there is enough of them within the next few years.
I think that was optimistic and forward looking, which sounds like a good thing. I'm all for that. One last question, because we're up against it. We're going to run out of time very shortly. But Juan Carlos asks, how does remote work change the way we ask questions? I guess at the kind of at the nub of this is, when we're in a room together as human beings, do we have a different way of understanding questions as opposed to when we do it virtually? Does that make a difference?
I really think it does. The example you gave before, Des, talking about, I could see it in her eyes. All kinds of things can be going on in your eyes right now. I have no clue. So
not that much going on, probably.
but it is very difficult, right?
Yeah.
So I you can comment. I have numerous times I have found myself saying, someone is asking a question, in a non-virtual, in a real setting, someone is asking me a question, and the only thing I can do is I want to say, please say more about that question, because I can look at that person and can see they are asking the question because they want to tell me something. Yeah. So I need them to tell me that before I come up with an answer. I think if the three of us would have had a non-virtual conversation right now, that would have happened a lot of times as well, but it didn't at any point in this conversation, because I cannot see you.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. We can't pick up all the cues that we would normally pick up. And they have a saying, again, Erin Meig, referring back to her book, The Culture Map, where she says they talk in Japan about reading the air. Which is the thing of reading the eyes. But of course, if you're in the same space reading the same air, then you're going to get a different thing. And we're all in different countries probably, and we're reading different air. The air here is quite cold and full of moisture because it's raining. But that's just England probably.
It's not Copenhagen.
We are out of time. I'm glad Patty Barker says, I love this conversation, the power of questions that can facilitate insights. Glad you enjoyed it, Patty. Where can people find out more about your work, Pia? What's available?
You can find me on LinkedIn, and then I have a website called pialauritzen.dk. So that's the place where I have everything. So that should be easy.
Check it out, pialauritzen.dk, and there's a wealth of materials there. Look out for Pia's articles in Strategy and Business and elsewhere, and obviously look out for a new book when eventually that appears. And obviously we'll be talking to Pia before then, and when the book comes out as well. Thank you everyone from throughout the world for joining us for this session, and thank you very much, Pia.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.